Hi Naomi, thank you for meeting with me today. As you know, we're going to be talking about ADHD. So I'd just like to start by asking you, what does ADHD mean to you?
Well, how I explain it to myself is that it's differently wired. It's a neurodevelopmental condition, which means that developmental means it's from birth and it's about my brain. But I don't consider it as a negative thing, I consider it as a difference.
When did you first become aware, Naomi, that you might have ADHD?
Well, in my job as a speech and language therapist, I worked with many children with ADHD, and I also gave a lot of lectures to teachers about working with children with ADHD in classrooms. And gradually, I realised that I was identifying with the things that I was describing, and also with the hints and tips that I was giving to teachers. I suddenly realised that would have been really helpful to me when I was at school.
Did you start trying to use out some of those hints and tips that you were giving to the teachers?
Well, I think I'd already started developing strategies that meant that I could get by in life. This was all happening in my late 50s, and by then I'd had 50 years of getting used to things. So I'd already developed strategies like writing lists for everything, not relying on my memory, colour coding things because that makes it more interesting. But there were still things that are very typical of ADHD that were going on for me, like procrastination, avoiding things that take some time or are going to take some concentration.
I'm sure that probably sounds familiar to quite a few people who are listening. And getting an adult diagnosis takes a lot of time and can be quite a scary thing. People worry about what their colleagues might say, what their friends might say, and their family. Why did you decide to actually go down the route of pursuing a diagnosis?
Well, I was very curious. I began to realise that this might be the case and therefore it might be helpful. I'm a person, possibly because I'm Naomi, possibly because of my ADHD, but I'm curious and I want to know. I don't shy away from anything. Sticking my head in the sand has never happened for me. But I also wasn't quite sure how other people were going to respond to the fact that I was checking things out. So I only told a family member and my partner that I was going to be assessed. I also then needed to tell my sister because she was part of the assessment process because she's known me since I was a child. I think I was intending to keep any outcome to myself at that time because I was worried about how people might react.
How long was it from the time that you started pursuing the diagnosis until an actual diagnosis was confirmed?
It took about 2 years because it was difficult to get my GP to accept that this was something I wanted to do, and also to get the service provided. I needed to wait for some time for a very helpful psychiatrist who was able to spend about 6 months in the process of helping me work out whether or not there is a diagnosis of ADHD there.
Wow, that is a long time.
Yes, one of the things that I needed to do was to ask family members or friends that had known me for a long time about how they would describe me as a child and as an adult. And I also was able to talk to the psychiatrist about things that suddenly seemed to snap into place. For example, my mum used to tell me that when we went shopping, I used to roll around on the floor and I tended to roll through a clothes rail to the other side and then stand up and be lost. She took me, she was working in a reception class as a teacher and she used to take me as a 3-year-old to school with her, and apparently I just used to wander around all the time. At school, when I went, they called me a butterfly. I flitted from thing to thing. All these things began to click.
So ADHD is quite often portrayed in a negative light in the media. But we know that there are challenges, but there's also positives. So can you tell us how ADHD affects you?
I do try and see it as a blessing, not a curse. And I'm really pleased that I came up with that phrase, this is a blessing, not a curse. And this is what I keep telling myself. I focus on the positives. I have abundant energy. I know that I wear people out. But another side of that is I'm very driven to achieve change. With regard to the negatives, I try to see the funny side now rather than to tell myself off for things. And believe me, with ADHD, there are some funny things. I love buying books, but I never read them. Or I read the last chapter first, then I go back to the beginning and I read about a third, and then I lose interest. So my bookshelves at home have lots and lots of books that have a post-it note about a third of the way through, because that's as far as I got. I am actually trying Audible for books at the moment, but I'm probably about halfway through about 4 that are on my phone at the moment. There's also the hyper-focusing. So this is when people with ADHD absolutely focus on something and don't notice anything else going on around them. One example was when I and my partner, who we clearly know has ADHD, but because of COVID hasn't yet had his diagnosis sorted, we were sitting in a festival field. It had come to the end of the evening and we were chatting. We were deep in conversation, and then security came up, and we hadn't realised that actually thousands of people had left the field and we were still sitting there on deck chairs in the middle, lost in conversation.
Was that both of you?
The two of us, yes. It's called hyper-focusing. Another time I was reading a book on a plane. Bear in mind, I only read short stories or bits of or textbooks, but I'd completely hyper-focusing. I hadn't realised that the plane had landed and everyone had got off the plane, and there was just me and the cabin crew there. So I got up quickly and very embarrassed and got off and left behind my expensive headset, which typical, absolutely classic ADHD, we leave things on buses, we leave things behind at restaurants.
That must be very odd, though, to suddenly kind of come to and realise that you've kind of missed out a lot of time because you've been so focused.
Absolutely. And wondering what on earth went on in that time and whether or not somebody had tried to stir me, but I just was in my own little dream world.
So what year was it that you got diagnosed with your ADHD?
I was 58, and I always say that it's there's something ironic about the fact that I had to wait 58 years for a diagnosis of something that makes you impatient. So that was 4 years ago, and I found since then it's been really helpful for me to know.
So 4 years ago, that was, you set up Communicourt in 2011, which is a long time before your diagnosis. Looking back now, how do you think your ADHD traits helped you to set up Communicourt?
It's a difficult question whenever I'm asked about how it's affected me, because I'm not sure what Naomi is like or would have been like without ADHD. This is something that comes from birth. So it's hard to separate those two things. In trying to understand what I'm like, what I'd be like without ADHD, I was thinking that I am very much like my dad was in lots of ways, but then the more I think about it, the more I think that possibly my dad also had ADHD, and it's something that runs in families. I do take a lot of risks, and I think that has been very helpful in some of the things that I've done. I wasn't scared of risking everything to set up Communicourt, which was something that I really, really believed in. And I'm aware that people with ADHD have a shorter lifespan than other people, not because they get ill, but because they take a lot of risks. Lots of people have said to me, I wish I could take the risks that you take, but of course they don't take those risks. Another thing that goes with having ADHD is to be very creative, and I've always been very, very creative.
You said before about hyper-focus. Do you think that being hyper-focused about work has ever helped you initially to start up the company?
Yes, and I think there were times when I couldn't think about anything else. And I stayed up at night for hours on end, reading up on things and planning things on the computer without realising how many hours had gone by, because I was totally hyper-focused.
So you learnt a lot very quickly as well at the beginning.
I had to, yes.
In Communicourt, we support a lot of people who have ADHD and other neurodiverse conditions. Did you recognise or identify with any of these behaviours when you're supporting people with ADHD at the beginning of Communicourt?
I'm not sure that I did, but I certainly had a lot of empathy for people that couldn't sit still in the dock or couldn't sit still in court, because I struggle with that as well. Concentrating in long conferences is really difficult. Within Communicourt, I struggle to have long business meetings, and so I'm always the first to offer to go and make the drinks because that gives me an excuse to get up and walk around. So any excuse to get up and walk around just means that I can come back and focus. I remember things very visually, and so I can empathise with people with ADHD that we're working with who need a visual aid.
So what do you think the perceptions and misconceptions of ADHD and neurodiversity are within the workplace?
Well, I'm sort of glad that I didn't have a diagnosis and I didn't know I'd got ADHD when I was first looking at jobs, when I was being employed, because I think if I'd have needed to tell people, there would have been a very negative response to that. I think there's a lot of ignorance around ADHD. People think that a child with ADHD, they think about a child with ADHD, they think about a child being stroppy. It's associated with being a bolshy child, about losing temper, and to some extent as an excuse for unacceptable behaviour. So they may not have wanted to employ me, but I've solved that by employing myself.
I know you've said about, you've commented before about ADHD not being an excuse. Is that something that you've employed on a daily basis, thinking about your own work ethos?
Yes, I don't use it as an excuse, but I use it as something that I need to manage. So, for example, I started swimming lessons recently, last year, and Francesca was saying, do you want a 45-minute lesson or a half an hour lesson? And I knew that actually half an hour was going to be enough if I was going to have to really concentrate on something. So I do tell people I have ADHD now, even though I didn't to start with, but I do now because I think people need to know that people that appear to be ordinary people might have all sorts of things going on behind the scenes that I can concentrate in meetings, but I come out of a meeting much more tired than other people do because it's very difficult to stay focused. So yes, I do tell people, but I don't use it as an excuse. I just say, this is how it is. How can we manage this better?
Naomi, Communicourt works mainly in the family and criminal courts. From your experiences, what are some of the biggest barriers in court that people who have ADHD may come up against?
Concentrating for long periods of time without any visual clues. I think it's very difficult for anybody to concentrate while sitting in a dock or sitting in a courtroom where a lot of things that are going on are above your level of understanding. But for the person with ADHD, that's particularly difficult. You can't just get up and walk around when you need to.
That must be really hard when you've had to be the person supporting somebody else with ADHD.
Absolutely. But I can do it because I've got strategies, but it means that I get tired quicker.
Do you think that those strategies are something which really make the difference between being able to manage and not being able to manage?
Yes, I'm lucky in that I have been able to develop my own strategies, but many people wouldn't be able to develop their own strategies and would need some help to work out what they could do.
When looking at ADHD in the workplace, what are some of the things that businesses could do to make the workplace a more inclusive area for people with ADHD?
Well, I think there needs to be a general broadening of attitude. People with ADHD may be different from the norm, but that doesn't mean that they're not as good as the norm, whatever norm means. We also bring different qualities, drive, energy and creativity that generally is more so than others. Got all that wrong. We also bring qualities such as drive, energy and creativity that other people may not be able to. Just because we're in the minority doesn't mean that we are inferior. The example I might give is that people with ginger hair are in the minority, but that isn't a disadvantage. It may be considered a thing of beauty by some. To build a team, you need a variety of people with different skills and qualities. So it's quite helpful to have somebody with ADHD within a team, so long as you've got other people that have the other skills to balance that out. So I'd say to someone, go and do it. It may be that you do get a diagnosis of ADHD, and at least then you know what you're dealing with. I now know that my memory is poor, and this is to do with my ADHD, so I take notes all the time. If I go back 10, 15 years, I went through times in my life where what I was doing was trying very hard not to write things down so that I could tune my memory in. But now I realise that really isn't going to happen, and therefore instead of beating myself up about it, I just take notes all the time. And when things go wrong, instead of blaming myself, I blame the ADHD. Now, I don't use ADHD as an excuse to other people, but I use it as an excuse to myself, if you want to say that I get cross with the ADHD rather than blaming myself and then my confidence going down.
Has that been something that you dealt with in the past when things have gone wrong before
Yes.
you had your diagnosis?
Yes, I think it's affected my confidence in quite a big way. I now take notes. I have 3 notebooks which I carry around with me. One is, that's when I don't lose one like I did the other day, but one is everyday stuff to do with admin and work. Another one is a journal that I keep, which I write every couple of days about what I've done, where I've been, my feelings and emotions around that, so that I can revisit that, because I've realised that I've actually forgotten much of my past. So I quite like reading through that and remembering some happy things. And the third one is my Spanish book, which of course I find it really difficult to learn vocabulary, and so I write everything down in that. But I have to remember not to lose the books. I think if I'd have been diagnosed when I was a child, my life would have been quite differently. It would have been less unpleasant. If I look back at my school reports, anybody now looking at those school reports, it might as well have "this child has ADHD" written across it. It's got "Naomi can do good work." Naomi can do well when she concentrates. Naomi needs to concentrate on the task in front of her. So I had a bit of a bad time at school because it looked as if I wasn't working hard, but I was actually probably trying really, really hard, maybe trying harder than everybody else. It just didn't look that way. So if I'd have been born 50 years later, things might have been different. But what I'm left with is to get on with it as it is now and look back at the blessing that it's been and all the good things that it's brought for me.
Thank you, Naomi. It's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you, Frankie.